Consciousness is a dream that I pursue.
Comme les angles à l'œil fauve, je vendrai dans ton alcôve, et vers toi glisserai sans bruit, avec les hommes de la nuit.
He fumbles at your spirit as players at the keys. Before they drop full music on, he stuns you by degrees.
Sate sangue diwan, tros ankesiae, facilis descensus alert, noctes atque dies patet atru januatis, sed revocare gradum superasum.
Double, toilet, trouble, fire, burn, cauldron, bubble.
Full fathom 5, thy father lies. Of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that...
Come, ceiling night, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day. Light thickens and the crow makes wing to the rooky wood. Good things of day begin to droop and drowse, whilst night's black agents to their praise do rouse. Thou marvelst at my words, but hold thee still.
This is Twilight on the Western Door.
Sator, Aripo, Tenet, Opera, Rotas.
Consciousness is a dream that I pursue.
This is Mason Winfield, host of Twilight on the Western Door, a program of discussions and interviews with world-class experts who take us from the roots of the paranormal to the cutting edge of understanding. Our subject tonight is ancient secrets and living cities. Most of us have been raised with the basic assumptions that when the whites came to North America, they developed the continent with no respect for native customs and insights, sweeping the landscape free of all native sights and expressions like someone clearing a table with a sweep of the arm. Many of us have the basic assumptions that there was no interchange between the cultures, Native American and Euro-American, as the whites developed North America. We've been brought up to think that thanks to capitalism, industrialization, and democracy, the modern world has almost no similarities to the worlds of the past. What we have come to presume, though, is not always correct. There's a week-old Archaeology magazine article that seems to get the picture. Santa Fe Institute professor Louis Betancourt researches urban dynamics as a lead investigator of Santa Fe Institute's Cities Scaling and Sustainability Research Program. Previous research has shown that as modern cities grow in population, so do many of their structures. What's more, these patterns in the development of urban infrastructure exhibit a surprising degree of mathematical regularity and predictability, a phenomenon called urban scaling. When Professor Betancourt gave a talk in 2013 on urban scaling theory, Scott Ortman, now an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at University of Colorado Boulder, noted that the trends Betancourt described were not particular to modern times. Their discussion prompted a research project on the effects of city size and function through history. Their results, published in the new AAS Open Access Journal Science Advances, indicate that despite notable differences in appearance and governance, ancient human settlements function and grow in much the same way as modern cities. It was shocking and unbelievable, says Scott Ortman. What we found here is that the fundamental drivers of robust socioeconomic patterns in modern cities precede all that. Ancient Native American cities were set up to be functional, but they were also set up to be sacred. The Native American mind did not necessarily hold the dichotomies that plague those of Europeans. To the Native American mind, the fact that a certain road, building, or place was used for other purposes did not detract from the fact that it could also be sacred. Could there be other patterns beside the material ones that could survive from the ancient days? Could there be secrets of a mystical kind that could pass themselves along cross-culturally? Could the ancient sacred places and power trails of Native American societies be perpetuated in living American cities? Using Buffalo, New York as the worthy example it is, urban shaman, visionary artist, and spiritual teacher Franklin LaVoie joins us today to use Buffalo, New York as an example for an explication of a number of his wonderful, unique ideas. Franklin, are you ready for a little walk right now onto the Twilight side?
Yes, Mason. Thank you.
Fantastic. Franklin, we're probably all familiar. Almost anyone listening to this program is probably familiar with the intensely Masonic city plan of Washington, D.C. There's the opinion that parts of Philadelphia were designed under the influence of perhaps the small Rosicrucian colony in nearby Wissahickon, one of the earliest mystical communities in the U.S. There are sacred and occult secrets about Charleston, South Carolina, and Charlotte, North Carolina. They may have had a much more intricate plan than many of us might have expected. It's likely that some southwestern American cities, including Tucson, were shaped about the layouts of earlier Native American communities. Many upstate New York cities, Batavia, Canandaigua, Rochester, Auburn, Syracuse, Rome, are sited above old Native American capitals. Now we find that Buffalo, New York may have a lot more metaphysical clout than anybody suspects. Franklin, whether it's by means of direct contact between the Illuminati of their respective societies, through the intervention of the Freemasons, through cross-cultural conferences, through some as yet unknown system of mystical communication, through the simple accident of usurpation of ancient sites and routes in modern city designs, how does it happen in your mind that ancient, sacred, urban designs and patterns can get perpetuated in today's Euro-American cities in North America?
Well, Mason, I think it is the geography perpetuates the cultural necessity. So probably the most significant fact to begin with regarding Buffalo is that it sits on the major crossroads of North America. The major water migration trail between the North Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, which is the St. Lawrence Seaway, Lake Ontario, Niagara Strait, Lake Erie, a portage to Chautauqua, a creek to the Allegheny, to the Ohio, to the Mississippi. That water migration trail intersects the major land migration trail, which connected the Central Plains to the Atlantic Ocean. And what's significant about that overland migration trail is that it does not wander through the Catskill and Appalachian Mountains. So it takes it follows the escarpment. And so we have the overland migration trail intersecting the water migration trail on the bullseye of Buffalo.
Wow.
So we can see that it's the geography to begin with. And then on top of that, we can find a lot of other esoteric connections, perhaps between the celestial influences of alignments with sunrises and sunsets of major solstices, equinoxes, and things like that. It's, and then there are the underground geomantic forces, underwater streams, electromagnetic fields influenced by crystals underground. It's very complicated.
You feel they all pile up right around Buffalo?
Oh, I do.
Hey, if we can take a quick tangent here, in terms of if somebody was looking at a map right now of the eastern seaboard, they'd see right what you're talking about. I mean, they would see the Great Lakes, particularly the upper Great Lakes, all feeding down, hitting at Buffalo, and all of a sudden you've got these water routes that go straight south with very few portages, if that's the pronunciation word, very little need to jump out of your boat. And they hook up with the Mississippi River system, and that takes you right down to the Gulf of Mexico. So anybody from anywhere who wanted to tour the Northeast would have used these water routes. The second question I wanted to ask you as a tangent is we're talking about the land route, the Great Migration Trail that goes east-west. In terms of New York State today, is that Route 5?
Route 5 and Route 90.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so many of the old native cities were on them.
Absolutely.
Right on them, Route 5.
Yep.
And if you track most of New York State history you find that almost everything upstate of any momentous consequence happened somewhere near Route 5. You know, all the sacred sites, the battles, the religious miracles, major villages. That's pretty heavy stuff. Well, we're going to give you lots of opportunity to develop your other ideas, Franklin. I hope you've got so much in you that not sure an hour is going to be quite enough. Now, for 25 years, Franklin, you've been investigating the deep history of Buffalo and the Niagara frontier. Have you observed any handful of major points that you would like to share with us in a sort of a general fashion? What have you observed about this area?
Well, I think it was my investigation into the deep history of Buffalo-Niagara that was most illuminating. And what I discovered was that there is a story that was expunged, and it may well be the most interesting story in North America. And that's the story of the Jaconsese, the mother of the nations.
The Peace Queen.
The Peace Queen. And so along with that, we have the crossroads and this Niagara escarpment. I was recently on Mackinac Island up in the Michigan Peninsula north, and they had a story of Jaconsese, daughter of Sky Woman, having a relationship with the thunder spirit in the sky. What intrigued me was that we're looking at the same Onondaga Flint escarpment that Mackinac is on. And on Mackinac is the Gitche Manitou, which Ross Hamilton, profound wizard, mystic, researched and claims that Mackinac is the serpent, the Uraeus, coming out of the forehead of a great Gitche Manitou, an image of a human being that stretches over many states. So this idea that there's a serpent coming out of the third eye and it is Mackinac itself, I found really intriguing. And Mackinac was an astonishing place because it has a tradition of being a time portal. Apparently they made a movie with Christopher Reeves.
Island?
Yeah.
What lake is that in?
It's at the confluence of the Huron, Michigan, and
okay.
Very close to Superior.
Okay.
This was like the strategic point of contention in the War of 1812. This was like the ground zero.
Well, yeah. If you had a hold of that, you were shutting off most of the action in the Western Great Lakes.
Right.
Huh. Interesting. Hey, we should clarify for listeners that Manitou is an Algonquin dialect word. And Algonquin's a big language family. There's a lot of different languages in it. It's like Iroquoian in that respect. But Manitou, as I gather it, Franklin, it's almost the same word as the Iroquois word orenda. Sort of means the force of life. And a lot of world societies have had a concept for this, the idea that there is a universal force out there that permeates everything. And supernatural beings and great wizards have a lot more of this force. And ordinary people can, work on a lot of their force too. What would you say is the most significant discovery you've made? If this is not a different point, or if it is, what's the most significant single discovery you've made about Buffalo's enchanted landscape?
Well, this would require a lot of preliminary explication. In Frederick Law Olmsted's integrated park system, I discovered human proportions.
No way.
And if we use Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, we can discover how the integrated park system was situated onto the ground. Between Niagara Square and Soldiers Place is the height of the landscape giant, and the giant is reaching to the Black Rock, to the Niagara River near Grand Island, and his foot is right on the edge of the Buffalo Bay, curiously right where the breakwall has a little break in it. So this landscape figure is in relation to the major migration trail that we talked about, the water migration trail.
Sure, hold that point. We should clarify for listeners that Vitruvian Man is an image that probably all of you have seen. It's found in, I guess, Leonardo's drawings.
Mm-hmm.
It's a drawing of a very clearly drawn
Probably Leonardo himself.
guy. Probably Leonardo drew that.
No, it's probably a portrait of Leonardo.
Oh, okay. It's a guy standing in the circle with his, he looks like he's got, what, 2 arms, Franklin?
He's in a circle and a square.
He's in a circle
squared
and a square, and he's got his arms outstretched
up
and at 2 different angles. So it's a guy that looks like he's got 4 arms
and 4 legs.
and 4 legs standing inside a circle and a square looking at you. A very familiar image. And the image of Vitruvian Man is highly symbolic. It's very expressive of a number of religious and mystical theories. So if indeed that figure is expressed in Frederick Law Olmsted's layout plan for Buffalo, Franklin, that is a knockout.
Yeah, absolutely.
I saw the Tree of Life, the Kabbalist Tree of Life in it.
Yes.
Do you think that's there?
No doubt about it.
Okay.
Absolutely. There are 10 Sephiroth on the Tree of Life, and in Olmsted's integrated park system, there are 6 of the 10 Sephiroth exactly in the situation.
It looked that way to me, too.
And they fall exactly on the landscape giant where you would expect them. And the landscape giant's head is framed by the top 3 Sephiroth, which represent the intellectual or mental sphere, the spiritual sphere. And it goes right to define the brain of the landscape giant, the mind. So that
You got all the chakras in there. And
humanity's mind or imagination defines their reach. Our reach is infinite.
And well, Olmsted, his landscape designs did not happen by accident. Frederick Law Olmsted we're speaking of, he was a mystic. He lived in the Hudson Valley. He traveled to China. He studied with Chinese mystics. He probably understood feng shui. He probably did some tutoring with Native American mystics in the Hudson Valley. A lot of them would have been Mohawk. It seems like he might have understood maybe the Iroquois system of sacred landscape. Franklin, this is pretty heavy.
Let me
Sorry, Franklin.
continue that thought.
Please do.
So here's a landscape giant, and the relationship of that landscape giant to the water migration trail is identical to what Robert Bivol and Gilbert Williams discovered in the Orion Mystery, which was published, I think, in 1990, somewhere thereabouts. In Egypt, we knew for at least a century from the pyramid texts this poetic idea that Egypt is Osiris and the Nile is the Milky Way. And this was considered to be poetry. But what Bivol discovered was that the 3 pyramids on the Giza Plain, including the Great Pyramid, are an exact map of the belt of Orion.
Orion's belt.
And there are pyramids on the plain that define Rigel, Mintica, Saiph, and Betelgeuse. And the relationship of that landscape giant in Egypt to Africa's major migration trail, the Nile River, is identical to what we see in the sky. Orion's relationship to the Milky Way is just what we see on the landscape of Egypt.
Yeah, the Giza Plateau with the 3 of the larger pyramids.
So what I discovered, and I consider it to be probably the most astonishing discovery of all, is that Buffalo's landscape giant is in relationship to North America's major migration trail exactly the same way.
No way.
Now, this region of the sky is known as the Duat. And in the Hermetica, I know I'm jumping ahead. You're going to ask me a question later. So.
Well, we'll find that out when I get there.
Okay, so we'll get back to this.
What are the Hermetica for the benefit of the listeners?
The Hermetica are ancient Egyptian scrolls that were probably translated around the 3rd century in Alexandria, Egypt. And so they're thought to be, and Hancock and Bivol in Talisman make a very good case that these are translations of much more ancient temple oral traditions that in around the 3rd century were then written down into scrolls. Those scrolls were known, but they were all in hieroglyphics. Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo the Great, sent people all over the Eastern world to see if he could find a translation of the Hermetica, and in 1460 it came back to him. So now
was it in Greek?
a Greek translation of the Hermetica arrived. Fico, I think it was either Ficini or Fico translated it, and now the ancient Egyptian nature magic, or what we call science, was available.
Yeah.
And what followed was the Renaissance.
For the benefit of listeners, the Hermetic Kabbalist tradition is sort of a broad name for the type of philosophies that appear to be at the roots of most Western mystical societies. I mean, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, Gnostics, there's a great many of them that kind of grow different flowers out of the same garden. And the garden is the Egyptian Greek mysteries we call Hermetica, combined with the Jewish mysteries we call Kabbalist, or of the Kabbalah. So, ready to go to another question, Franklin?
Well, just
or finish up.
Just to finish the thought, that we can see that the Hermetica has this injunction that whoever will recreate that region of the sky known as the Duat, which is Orion, Taurus, Gemini, the Milky Way, whoever recreates that in the landscape will be blessed profoundly and eternally.
As above, so below.
So it was done in Egypt, and apparently it was done here in Buffalo. The question is, was it done consciously, or was it some, impulse from the unconscious, which opens a big question as like, why, everything exists in the unconscious.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of the greatest poetic metaphors have come out of the unconscious mind.
Yeah,
I mean, there's no reason to think that a landscape planner who's that gifted and inspired wouldn't be responding to, all the levels.
I bring it up because I've questioned a number of great authorities, big, modern authors on Olmsted as to, is there any indication that Olmsted was involved in mystical traditions? And they all just look like blank.
Do they know mystical traditions?
They don't know in mystical traditions.
Right. So if they don't have anything to compare it to, I know it's kind of funny. I've run into that myself, I remember I shouldn't digress here, but I remember having a talk with a famous old East Aurora historian who was an expert on the Roycroft, and I was discovering at East Aurora's Roycroft community all these signs and symbols of mysticism, and I got the guy on the phone once and said, "Hey, do you think Albert Hubbard had any mystical interest?" And he goes, "No, there weren't any." And I go, well, okay, I can handle that, but what about this, and then how do you explain that? And there's a pause, and he goes, "Well, maybe he did."
Good. At least he acknowledges the possibility.
Oh, sure. Well, good scholars will do that. Great ones may not, but hey, is a pattern like this suggested or perpetuated? I know Buffalo's been your focus, but you have a broad mind. You have a broad understanding. Is this pattern or anything like it, Hermetic, Kabbalist, perpetuated in any other American cities that you know of?
Well, we've already heard about Washington, D.C., and let me just elaborate a little bit on that. The most interesting research on Washington, D.C. that I've seen shows us that if we overlay the architectural cross-section of the Great Pyramid, which would include the opening of the pyramid, the descending and ascending chambers, the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber, if we overlay that onto the floor plan or the ground plan of Washington, D.C., the Capitol building is the entrance to the pyramid, the White House is the King's Chamber, and interestingly, the Washington Monument and the Queen's Chamber line up. So what we see there is the greatest phallic symbol on earth penetrating the Queen's Chamber. So it's a symbol of this beautiful, loving energy that makes life possible.
Sure. Well, now that's something. Do you believe that the DC pattern was perpetuated by, the Freemasons, which
Absolutely.
is the surface explanation?
So we can trace a direct line of what do they call that? A direct line of influence from the Hermetica to the Freemasons to Pierre L'Enfant studying in France Campanella's design of Paris, which was another of Bauval's discovery, Robert Bauval, that Paris, France is a replica of Luxor, Egypt, where we find the Temple of Dendera and the earliest known temple of the mother goddess Isis. In Paris, at the Isle de Cité, that island where we find Notre Dame, at the time of the Paris Revolution, French Revolution, 1780s, it was a very prevalent idea that on the Isle de Cité was an ancient Egyptian temple to Isis. And Paris is named Par Isis, Paris. So L'Enfant studied the ground plan of Paris and then came and begged Washington to let him design the nation's capital, where we find, again, ancient Egyptian influences.
Oh, yeah.
The Great Pyramid.
Of course, the Egyptian influences would have been with almost any of the Freemasons. And I think it's worth pointing out with Washington, D.C., that L'Enfant got fired. George Washington canned his ass. I guess he was just causing a lot of problems. But it's interesting that the guys that patched up for him were the Ellicott brothers. Yes. And I don't know if you want me to say this or not, but Joseph Ellicott came and set up Buffalo.
Right. Exactly. So 5 years after they are surveying the 10-mile square of Washington, D.C., including the street designs, which are a reflection of the Great Pyramid, Joseph Ellicott is in Buffalo, and he is surveying the Western Tract, the Holland Purchase, and designs a radial street grid. And until you and I came along, nobody realized that there was something really mystical about the radial street grid.
Well, I'm flattered that you include me in that. I kind of foggily picked it up. But, we're going to take our break in about 2 minutes, so we probably shouldn't get into anything too heavy here. Do you think Joseph Ellicott, the designer of Buffalo Street Plan, do you think he was a Freemason?
Because he was a Quaker, he was sort of, there was some prohibition against him being a Freemason. But his brother Andrew, George Washington refers to him as his beloved brother Freemason. Yeah. So if Andrew was, as a brother to George Washington, then I imagine Joseph was as well. And certainly in the radial grid, we find the evidence of an enchanted landscape and the building blocks upon which Olmsted worked for this, the duat, the symbol of the Egyptian part of the sky where Horus will go in the afterlife, is represented on Buffalo's landscape by Olmsted, but Ellicott laid the foundation for that.
That's fantastic. Hey, there's a little bit of wackiness concerning Joseph Ellicott, the designer of Buffalo. I think he may have died on Halloween night. Is that a...
in Bedlam, no less. Yeah.
Jeez.
And one has to suspect there's something to do with the, what happened up there in Lewiston.
Because William Morgan.
He was in charge of everything. And when it hit the fan, Joseph Ellicott was holding the bag.
Holding the bag that you don't want to be holding.
Yeah.
This is Twilight on the Western Door. Thank you, everyone. We're taking our little break with Franklin LaVoie, and I'm learning the proverbial bag.
You're listening to Go Podcast Yourself Network.
Let's go check it out
at gopodcastyourself.com. And we love you.
Hi again, everybody. This is Mason Winfield, the host of Twilight on the Western Door, with my esteemed and highly intelligent guest, Franklin LaVoie. Franklin, you're still with us.
Yes, sir.
Now, Franklin, you've spoken and written about something called the Dragon Track, or the Dragon Path. I know it's a modification of John Michel's philosophy, but you've taken it a couple of steps beyond. Would you be willing to give us a quick primer on maybe a little introduction to the concept of the Dragon Track and how it relates to Buffalo, New York?
I'd like to try. The Dragon Track is a term that Robin Williamson used in The Five Denials on Merlin's Grave. It is from the Long Mei lines of ancient China, in which we find sacred sites aligned in very straight lines across the landscape, often pointing towards celestial alignments, either with stars or solstices and equinoxes. And I became familiar with it through John Michel's 12 Tribe Nations and the Science of Enchanting the Landscape, which I read when I was in California in 1989. And when I returned to Buffalo in 1990, and I went up onto the very peak of the city hall, I had an epiphany that Buffalo was part of the ancient Dragon Track, an ancient spiritual network that connects centers around the earth. Now, what informed me was that I had some inkling that there was a dragon legend associated with Niagara Falls. And I was just standing up there on the city hall. I recognized the radial grid, and I could see that it was a very significant geographic center with a dragon legend, just as I had read about in the 12 Tribe Nations. So I immediately went off to the Buffalo Historical Society and began researching, and the deeper I went, the clearer the image became that there's a really interesting story relating to the deep history of Buffalo, and yet I had hardly any inkling of it growing up.
Yeah. It's kind of underplayed in the Iroquoian legends in a way when you consider its importance. But the white guys, when they recorded these legends, they just sat down with as many storytellers as they could find or that would talk to them, and wrote down everything. And sometimes they get 20 slightly different versions of the same legend, and then you get the feeling there's a lot of stuff they completely miss. But so, in other words, maybe for the benefit of our listeners, many of our listeners may know what a ley line is, and probably technically just the word ley is all you need. Ley is an old word that means landscape, and the idea is, as Franklin aptly explained it, that you've got a bunch of sacred sites along a straight line in across landscape, and they're so straight, they're so well aligned with each other, and they point to very often celestial events like sunrises and moonrises. And I think this concept of the Dragon Track is the idea that one of these lays might not just be an 8 or 10 mile, 20 mile thing, that it could be something that might extend all the way around the planet. And I think you may have the theory, Franklin, that the Dragon Track itself, that the path that this line goes around the globe, that happens to go through Buffalo, but it's also got some significance to something in the sky, doesn't it?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing it up. Fairly early on, one of the really significant discoveries I made was that the Dragon Track intersects the equator at 60 degrees, this according to John Michel. And at this time of 2012, the Milky Way intersects the celestial equator at 63 degrees, and we're right at that, let's call it the equinoctial point. We're in the midst, so that now any time that the Dragon Track is directly overhead and you're standing at a point on Earth on the Dragon Track, everywhere on the Dragon Track you'll be underneath the Milky Way. So what I'm fumbling to say is that it occurs to me that the ancient dragon track may very well be a human reproduction of the Milky Way on the surface of the Earth. And to amplify that, the idea is that when those we love leave this realm, we bring their body to the graveyard, to the sacred spot, and we put them in the ground, and we send them on their way. And it's very archetypal. That is to say, it's a very universal idea that they're going to follow their spiritual road into the sky and into the galactic center, into the the great magic castle in the sky, or the happy hunting ground in the sky. So, just to repeat it, that the Dragon Track and the Milky Way seem to have a strong connection. Each is a spiritual path. Each is connected as a bridge between the worlds, between this world and the next world.
Now, if we were to envision the Dragon Track crossing the globe, at least as pertains to North America, it seems to be coming from the northeast and heading southwest, right? Yes. And it probably comes down the St. Lawrence River watershed, and it goes through Buffalo and heads into maybe... Are there other major sites that are along the Dragon Track in your experience?
Buffalo is on the western edge of it. So more specifically, and this was astonishing, was it connects Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, New Orleans, and Mexico, along with all of these other cities in Europe. But if I'm correct that it's a representation of the Milky Way is about, average about 9 degrees. So that's about 400 miles. And we're about 400 miles east of that. So
we may be on the edge.
And the water migration trail is exactly parallel. So here's this organic, geographic flow form of water, as well as the weather. The weather moves in the same direction, exactly following this spiritual force called the Dragon Track.
Wow. So I know probably to the listener, 400 miles sounds like a pretty wide band. It's a swashbuckling swath. But when you look at the size of the Earth, that's a 400 mile wide line. That's drawing a line with your pen across a piece of typing paper. I mean, it is fairly specific.
Yes.
Well, Franklin, let's head on to another one of your subjects. I've heard you speak many a time. You've spoken pretty eloquently about the concept of the other world. But considering that most of our listeners will not have ever had the privilege of hearing you deliver a lecture or a talk, can you, what would you say to elaborate on this concept of the other world? How would you distinguish the other world from, this world?
According to the Celtic bards, the other world was very close to our own. It was the land of the immortals and of heroes, and occasionally it was visited by poets. Sometimes it was entered through a lake or inside a hill or a mountain. Sometimes a journey was necessary. So if we unravel all of those little clues, we can say that the other world seems to be a heightened awareness of this reality. And think of the spectrum, infinite radiation patterns. And there are bright lines and there are dark lines. Well, our consciousness tends to get fixed into a very specific pattern of bright and dark lines, and that's just like a radio channel. We're tuned into one channel. But occasionally, the channel gets changed, and we realize there's an entirely other set of information available that we were completely unaware of. And this is, in fact, the way the universe is. That we're just fixed into this very specific little spectrum of reality, but occasionally we see a much broader picture. So that having been said, let me say that we're most familiar with the other world when we dream. We're familiar with dreaming. We go to sleep at night and we dream. I love this idea from the Maya that there are 3 kinds of dreams. There's just the dreams that we have and we forget. Occasionally there's a dream that really strikes us and we remember it and it kind of like really stays with us. And then there's a 3rd kind of dream that can really change your life. I mean, they can like maybe foretell the future or just like wake us up from the dream so that we really transform. And this is a clue as to how an experience of the other world can affect us. As I said, poets can occasionally enter the other world. And when we have an experience of the other world, it is unbelievable. You're sitting there, you're wide awake, and suddenly there's this entire other experience going on. And you're aware that you're sitting there, and you're aware that you're wide awake, but you're extraordinarily aware that there's this entirely other dream taking place, but you're not asleep. You've entered the other world.
That was, going back to one of your earlier points, that was pretty much the model for the truest of the Celtic poets, that somebody like a Thomas the Rhymer or Raftery or Yeats, probably, the more recent to our time, that they set foot in fairyland, in the other world, and they were given skills, but they were also sort of cursed in a way. And they came back to earth with greater talents and greater drawbacks. But, speaking of steps into the other world, you, my friend, had a remarkable visionary experience in Tulum, Mexico. Was that 2009?
2005.
2005. And you actually wrote an article about this, well-written, and published it in an anthology called Exploring the Edge Realms of Consciousness. And this was published in 2012?
Yes.
And your article was called Journey Through a Cosmic Portal, a Serpent Ladder. Can you kind of summarize that for us? Tell us anything about it?
It's so complicated. It's difficult to abbreviate it. But it began with my arrival at the Buffalo airport, and it ended with my return to Buffalo. And in between there were a series of very unusual circumstances, including 3 visionary states in which I sat in meditation and was completely engulfed by a vision in which So the circumstances of going to Tulum was to celebrate the life of a very dear and very significant friend, Sana Parker, who was probably the most charismatic human being I ever met, and most people who met her had ever met. And she was, when I met her, I called her Sana Christ Superstar, and she called me Dr. Galaxy. And she passed away in, I think it was 2003, from a brain tumor. And we went to Tulum to celebrate her life in Tulum. Back in the 70s, she lived in Tulum in a very, doing dances on the beach and organizing the community to clean up the beaches and really transform Tulum. And as I sat on the beaches of Tulum, where she had been, literally sticking sticks in the ground to create a little cage so the jaguars wouldn't get at her, I had an extraordinary vision. And I guess I would just say that I descended. Now, there was a celestial alignment that day. There was a full moon in galactic center, and it was May 21st, so that the sun was conjunct the Pleiades on the zenith. And this is exactly what the Mayan calendar is all about, the conjunction of the sun on the zenith with the Pleiades. That's the nature of the Chichen Itza calendar.
That's why you picked the day, right?
No, it was a total, I mean, you have to read the article to realize how I stumbled into this like the holy fool.
I did. I missed that part.
Yeah, I mean, none of this was planned.
Oh, wow.
At all. But be that as it may, I just happened to be there at this extraordinary alignment, and to make a long story short, in the vision, I descended through a cosmic portal, through a serpent, through a cosmic portal in the earth, down to the land of the dead and of shadows, which is not a bad place at all. It was a beautiful place where full moonlight falls on white moonstone under a beautiful bower of trees, and our loved ones greet us with the warmth of candlelight, and loved ones that we have forgotten about from many lifetimes are there to greet our when we return, filled with love, filled with understanding of what we've been through. And my spirit went up into the Paradise Islands on the Pleiades, where there are just like an endless, very good-natured party going on. Birds are singing in the trees. People are in love. There's dancing. There's music. Every kind of delight is going on. And simultaneously, I descended and ascended into these two extremes of the cosmos. And it was, I would say, it wasn't because I had done anything, but it was because, the grace of Sana, had led me to see that she was okay, that, in her death she had really made it to heaven and paradise.
When I read that article of yours, and anyone who wants to get led to it can contact us at our Facebook page or our website, Twilight on the Western Door. We'll scoot you right to the link. But I found myself really admiring again the way you have internalized Native American legend, religion, mythology. I mean, you've done that with the Iroquois. I mean, you've applied basically depth meditation to the West New York landscape based on your intuition and your appreciation of Iroquois and Haudenosaunee lore and mythology. And it seems like you've gone pretty far with the Maya too. I mean, would you consider yourself sort of a armchair student of the Mayan Book of the Dead, the Popol Vuh?
No, I'm in love with it. I became familiar with it reading John Major Jenkins' Maya Cosmogenesis, and John Major Jenkins has become a dear friend, and I met him on in the alignment of 2012. I went down to Honduras to meet him, and we became fast friends. And so, I'm no scholar of the Popol Vuh, but I've been aware of it since the early 80s, and the mythology is profound, and as all mythology, it's taking place inside the body, and these are lessons that were left by our ancestors for their progeny in order for us to cope with the human condition. But you have to internalize the myth. You can't just read a myth and make sense of it. You have to memorize the myth. You have to sleep with it. And one day, like a seed, it opens and it grows and it offers its fruit. And then you understand what this myth is about.
Yeah, there's you run into this a lot in paranormal realms that somebody who's had no training will walk up to an ancient wall carving or a bas-relief or a document or a statue and go, "See, there's your proof. There's the aliens," And it's really cool to see that you haven't done that. You were studying 2012 way back in the early 1980s. What did you, if this isn't classified, just out of curiosity, what did you end up doing on December 21st, 2012? Were you battening down the hatches in an elevator somewhere, or what were you doing?
I was absolutely blessed. I found myself in Copan in Honduras at the most elaborate Mayan temple site with John Major Jenkins, who was the genius who had cracked the long count calendar to understand why the long count calendar ended on December 21st, 2012. It was because they were able to measure and see that the winter solstice sun would conjunct the galactic center on December 21st, 2012. So winter solstice is the dark night, and galactic center is the belly of the sky. Also, winter solstice is the birth of light. The light begins to return. So here was in the great year, the 26,000 year, here was the birth of light coming from the galactic belly. This was like the big sign of the great birth of a new age, a new 144,000 day period of 5,120 years, for example. So I spent the morning with John Major Jenkins. We found our way up to the galactic portal on the ruins in Copan, and just had a wonderful time there.
Oh, man. So you guys were climbing on one of those pyramids?
Yeah.
And they let you do that down there?
Yeah.
Or they just didn't know you guys were doing it?
Well,
right?
At sunrise, I was in the ball court with a little foam rubber skull that I had carved, and I was playing with one Hunapu's head.
Now, I know they didn't know you guys were doing that.
They told me to stop. but it was great. So as the sun was rising on December 21st, 2012, like the Hero Twins, I was in the ball court playing with one Hunapu's head against the lords of the underworld, who told me to stop. And without my ego, I said, okay.
I think if the lords of the underworld gave me some advice, I don't know about you, but I think I would probably give it serious credence.
They were well armed, so it was the prudent thing to do.
I would figure. Well, we've talked a bit about the other world here, and we've been talking about the enchanted landscape. What would you say, and let's apply it to perhaps living in a modern American city, even a Buffalo, New York, if we want to use that as a springboard. But so we've created an enchanted landscape. Somehow or other, an enchanted landscape has been set out upon the floor plan of a city. Yes. And now we're living in it. And even though the city's changed a lot, it's expanded, very often that original old core is still there.
Yes.
Still got it in Buffalo, still got it in Philly, still got it in D.C., probably have it in other places that we don't even know about. How does that affect us? How can we exploit it?
Well, I think becoming aware of it, we are privy to an altered state of consciousness. So when I first discovered that Buffalo had a landscape giant, that Frederick Law Olmsted's integrated park system had the proportions of a human figure, and Vitruvian man clearly defined how it was laid out, I found myself, moving through the city, appreciating where in the body I was. And so it was a whole different experience of the city. And when I began doing the presentations on the enchanted landscape of Buffalo, people were still fleeing the city. Buffalo was still considered a very depressed Rust Belt kind of wasteland. And I was, telling people that actually it's a very profound, ancient spiritual center. And they'd say, well, then how come it's so depressed? And I would say, well, we have to be really careful about, what we want to happen. Because if we live through an economic boom, this could be a catastrophe. All the beautiful green space that surrounds Buffalo for 40 miles could become an endless abandoned strip mall. And so I've been telling people, I think that, there's been a spiritual protection around Buffalo. But now, here it is 25 years later, and Buffalo is starting to, really enter into the consciousness as a really happening place. It was the arts primarily that it made it happen. And so what is the Dragon Track? On another level, the Dragon Track is this spiritual energy which resides within us, which is our perfectly natural divinely inspired consciousness. And on top of that is all of this stuff that gets laid on there. If we can get through all that and get to the real core of our being, we're created in the image of the Creator. So if we're not being creative, we're suffering from an identity crisis. And so when we see that Buffalo is laid out in patterns that honor the perennial philosophy, this is that philosophy that's inspired by geometry. Geometry is the measure of space. Space is the fundamental field. All things exist in space. And geometry is what measures space. And that is the foundation of the perennial philosophy. But the perennial philosophy takes geometry and applies it to the human condition, so that, as in the case of the Tree of Life, we're shown a way to transcend our narcissistic self-absorption in which we are born, to overcome that narcissistic self-absorption and begin to interact and give to society and become a beacon of society. And if we really achieve that, we can achieve what is our lot, what is possible. The only possibility we have for immortality is that we'll be remembered forever. Do this in memory of me, say the great mages. And they leave an example of serving people, of doing kind things for people, of respecting all species, of honoring space. It's almost it's not the antithesis of economics, but it's economics brought up to a level of like understanding the earth is a living mother that we need to approach with respect and love and attention to the future. So I think that, recognizing the enchanted landscape introduces us to the perennial philosophy, and the perennial philosophy is the philosophy that really sets us on the right path, really sets us on the path of service, of community, of ecology, all of this.
Well, going back to your comment about some of the things people say to you, if Buffalo's got this mighty plan, why is it so depressed? But in all the literature, the hero's journey, the hero that's ever going to attain true enlightenment has a period of wandering confusion. I mean, Lancelot has it. Orlando has it. It could be that Buffalo has to rise and fall, and it looks like it might be on its way up. I can hear our credits fading in just a little bit. Franklin, anybody that wants to track you down for a talk or a lecture or anything can track you through us. What do you got going on coming up soon? Anything special coming up for 2015?
I'm going to be working on a puppet show for the Cherry Blossom Festival, which is May 3rd through the 9th at the Japanese Gardens behind the Buffalo Historical Society. And myself and Daniel Renauld will be doing The Bamboo Princess.
That's fantastic. I hear our very mysterious and entrancing closing credits fading in again, for which we thank, the music that is, the Afro-Celt Sound System, a Scottish African fusion band that we admire so much. They sound like what we mean. We thank them for their work, as we thank Chris Starr, Carolyn Smith, and the whole GPY Radio Go Podcast Yourself network. We thank our engineers and support staff, Dale Smith, Devilish DJ Scott Spencer. Most of all, we thank our revered guest, Franklin LaVoie. You can contact Franklin again for speaking events through our website, Facebook page, Twilight on the Western Door. Otherwise, until we meet again in the twilight, shine in that light whose smile kindles the universe. Work every day to make this a better world.